In July 1942, Japan was unbeatable. Not on paper, in reality. Every Allied army that had faced them on the ground had been defeated, surrendered, or destroyed. Singapore, the Philippines, Malaya, Rabaul, and now Japan was moving south, toward Australia. The only thing standing between the Japanese army and Port Moresby, the strategic key to the entire South Pacific, was a group of Australian teenagers who had been sent to Papua New Guinea to do construction work. Not to fight, to build things. I spent months going through Australian War Memorial records, 39th Battalion unit diaries, and Kokoda campaign assessments to bring you this documentary. What's at stake here isn't just one jungle campaign in one forgotten theater of the Second World War. It's the question of why a group of 18 and 19-year-old boys from Victorian country towns held the line against the most experienced jungle army in the world, and why the rest of the world has been crediting someone else for it ever since. Everyone knows America stopped Japan in the Pacific. That's the version in every Hollywood film, every American history book, every documentary made about the Pacific War. But here's what that version leaves out. Before America had a coherent plan for the Pacific, before Guadalcanal, before any American counteroffensive was ready to launch, a group of Australian teenagers was already doing it. In a jungle nobody had heard of. On a track that didn't appear on most military maps. This is their story. And it starts here. On the 15th of February, 1942, Singapore fell. 130,000 Allied soldiers surrendered to a Japanese force half their size. And every experienced Australian soldier worth sending to a jungle war was on the wrong side of the world. By July 1942, Japan had taken Rabaul, Lae, Salamoa. The entire northern arc of Papua New Guinea was under Japanese control. And on the 21st of July, Japanese forces landed at Gona and Buna on the northern coast of Papua. Their objective was Port Moresby. Port Moresby was not just a town. It was the strategic key to the entire South Pacific. Its harbor and airfields gave whoever controlled it the ability to strike the north of Australia directly, to block Allied supply lines, to isolate Australia from the United States and New Zealand. Lose Port Moresby and Australia's position in the war became catastrophic. Between the Japanese landing beaches at Gona and Buna and Port Moresby stood one obstacle, the Owen Stanley Range, and through those mountains ran a track, the Kokoda Track. Someone had to defend it. The Australian government looked at what was available. The experienced soldiers, the battle-hardened veterans of the 2nd AIF who had fought in North Africa and the Middle East were still on ships coming home. They hadn't arrived yet. What was available was the 39th Battalion, a militia unit, local defense forces, men who had enlisted for home service rather than overseas deployment. Boys, mostly. 18 and 19-year-olds from Victoria who had been sent to Papua New Guinea not to fight a jungle war, but to do construction work. To build things. They had minimal combat training, outdated equipment, no experience of jungle warfare, no experience of any warfare. And they were about to walk into the Owen Stanley Range to face the Japanese army that had conquered half of Asia without losing a battle on land. 697 kilometers. That's the distance between the Japanese landing beaches at Gona and Port Moresby. 96 kilometers on a map looks manageable. On the ground, it was something else entirely. The Kokoda Track was not a road. It was a footpath, a narrow trail cutting through the Owen Stanley Range at its lowest and most accessible point, which, in the Owen Stanley Range, still meant razor-sharp ridgelines, deep valleys filled with streams and waterfalls, and jungle so dense that sunlight never reached the ground. The rain was constant. Not occasional rain. Not seasonal rain. Rain that fell every day, turning the track into a river of mud that pulled at boots with every step and made every surface treacherous. Ascents that went straight up. Descents that went straight down. Men crawling on hands and knees up slopes so steep that a single slip meant falling onto the soldier below. And then doing it again. For 697 kilometers. The disease started almost immediately. Malaria hit up to 95% of men operating in the coastal areas. Dysentery spread through the ranks from contaminated water and the impossibility of maintaining hygiene in permanent rain and mud. 30 to 80 men evacuated daily from disease alone. Tropical ulcers opened on legs and feet, wounds that in any hospital would have been treated in days, left untreated in the jungle because there was no way to evacuate men fast enough. More Australians were destroyed by disease on the Kokoda track than by Japanese bullets. The jungle killed them slowly. The Japanese killed them fast. And the Japanese had every advantage that mattered in that environment. The South Seas Force under General Hori numbered between 10,000 and 13,500 men. Elite veterans. The 144th Regiment soldiers who had fought across Asia, who were trained for jungle warfare, who were equipped with light artillery and knew how to use the terrain. Against them, the 39th Battalion, 400 to 1,000 men, depending on the phase of the campaign. Teenagers, construction workers, boys who had come to Papua New Guinea to build things, facing the most experienced jungle army in the world, on the worst possible terrain, with the worst possible equipment, and orders to hold. John Mackay was 17 when he enlisted. His father had fought in the First World War. John didn't wait to be called up. He walked into the recruitment office and signed the papers before anyone told him to. He ended up on the Kokoda track at 18, defending an airstrip under Japanese bombardment, doing something that no training manual had prepared him for because there hadn't been enough time for proper training. George was 18, from Korumbura in Gippsland. He'd been working in a hardware store. His older brother had enlisted first. George followed him in July 1942. Within weeks, he was in the Owen Stanley Range with a rifle, a limited supply of ammunition, and a Japanese army of 13,000 veterans pressing down the track toward him. These were the men of the 39th Battalion, not hardened soldiers. Kids from Victorian country towns and Melbourne suburbs who had been called up for national service from October 1941 and given the minimum training before being shipped to Papua New Guinea. By the time the Japanese advance reached them in July 1942, the 39th Battalion had already been retreating for weeks. They had lost Kokoda. They had fallen back to Daniki. And they were dying. Not just from Japanese bullets, from the track itself. Uniforms rotting in the permanent humidity. Feet destroyed by mud and roots and weeks of continuous movement. Malaria taking men out of the line faster than reinforcements could arrive. Dysentery spreading through every position. Their rations were rice and tinned meat. Not enough to sustain men doing what they were being asked to do. They called themselves the Grey Ghosts. Not because it sounded heroic, because that's what they looked like. Skeletal, hollow-eyed, covered in mud. Moving through jungle so dark it felt like night at midday. On the 16th of August, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor arrived at Isurava to take command. He was 38 years old, a veteran of Tobruk, a man who had seen real combat and knew what a broken unit looked like. What he found at Isurava was not a battalion. It was a collection of exhausted boys who had been holding the impossible for weeks without adequate food, without adequate medicine, without adequate ammunition, and without anyone telling them how long they had to hold. Hunter walked among them. He looked at what he had, and he reorganized them into defensive positions on the high ground above Isurava. Bayonets fixed, helmets on, positions assigned. He didn't tell them it was going to be easy. He told them what needed to be done, and they did it. The Battle of Isurava ran from the 26th to the 31st of August, 1942. The Japanese came in waves. Superior in numbers, superior in experience, superior in everything that a military analyst would use to predict the outcome of a battle. The 39th Battalion held. Not because they had the better tactical position, though Honor had given them the best he could find. Not because they had superior firepower, they didn't. But because walking away was not something these boys from Victorian country towns had in them. On the 30th and 31st of August, the Japanese broke through the lines. The Marubra force, the 39th and the units fighting alongside them had to withdraw. But Honor controlled that withdrawal, bought the time needed for AIF reinforcements to arrive, kept a force in the field that should, by every calculation, have ceased to exist weeks earlier. The 39th Battalion suffered more than 50% casualties on the Kokoda track. More than half the men who walked into that jungle didn't walk out in the same condition they went in. Many didn't walk out at all. But Port Moresby didn't fall. The Japanese advance that had seemed unstoppable, the advance that had swept through Malaya, through Singapore, through island after island in the Pacific, ran out of momentum on a jungle track defended by teenagers from Victoria. Boys who had been working in hardware stores and farms 3 months earlier. Boys who had been given rifles and minimal training and sent into the worst terrain on Earth. Boys who held when they had no right to hold. And who bought enough time for the tide to turn? Kokoda is remembered in Australia. Every year, every Anzac Day, in schools and memorials and documentaries. But outside Australia, in the histories written in Washington and London and Tokyo, it is a footnote. A skirmish on a jungle track in a theater that was secondary to the real war. The boys of the 39th Battalion don't fit that narrative. They never did. But they held Port Moresby. And without Port Moresby, the entire Allied position in the South Pacific looks different. That's not a footnote. That's the story. And it belongs to a group of Australian teenagers who had no right to win. And won anyway. There's a question this documentary hasn't answered yet. The 39th Battalion stopped the advance. But what happened to the Japanese force that was stopped? What happened to the men who pushed them back through the same jungle, over the same track, back to the beaches at Gona and Buna? That campaign, the counteroffensive that finished what the 39th started, is one of the most brutal and least known chapters of the entire Pacific War. And it's the next story this channel tells. If you want to see it, it's right up here.